Robert Bob Jenkins considered himself a patient man. At 68, he'd spent most of his adult years working in logistics for a large shipping company. He wasn't the type to get riled up easily. After retiring 2 years ago, Bob and his wife Martha had moved to a well-manicured community called Maplewood Gables. The place boasted lush sidewalks, symmetrical rows of pastel-colored homes, and a small but primly clipped pond area that doubled as a communal park. They'd chosen Maplewood Gables for its promise of a peaceful retirement lifestyle, at least according to the glossy brochure. But Bob soon discovered that peaceful at Maplewood Gables came with a laundry list of rules. At first, these rules had seemed harmless enough: no feeding ducks at the pond, no parking on the street overnight, no basketball hoops on driveways. None of that bothered him. He didn't own a basketball hoop, and he had a garage big enough for 2 cars. Bob and Martha were content. They chatted casually with neighbors, attended the occasional community potluck, and minded their own business. That changed when Bob received a letter in the mail from the Homeowners Association board. Its thick envelope was sealed with the official Maplewood Gables emblem, a cartoonish oak tree in front of a tidy row of houses. Bob noticed that, inside the envelope, there were not 1 but 3 separate documents. The first was a friendly reminder about the community guidelines. The second was a notice that the HOA had observed a potential violation on his property. The third, which was printed in bright red ink, was a clear warning: non-compliance could incur a fine of up to $500. As Bob read through the letter, his mind flipped through possibilities. He and Martha kept their lawn neatly trimmed, the walkway was always swept clean of leaves, and their windowsills boasted exactly the neutral curtains recommended by the HOA's guidelines. A violation? Of what? He turned to the last page and finally saw it, a blurry photo of a small object peeking out from the corner of his flower bed. The letter alleged that Bob had placed excessive, unapproved ornamentation on his property. In short, they were talking about Bob's new lawn gnome. The gnome itself was innocent enough, a whimsical little fellow with a pointy red hat and a fishing pole, perched between a patch of lavender and a pair of hydrangeas. Martha had bought it for Bob at a local crafts fair. She said it reminded her of him, a touch grumpy yet oddly charming. Bob had never been a big fan of lawn decorations, but this one struck a chord. He placed the gnome so it appeared to cast an imaginary fishing line into a shallow bird bath. To Bob, it was a fun, harmless addition to the yard. Yet apparently, the HOA saw it as a dire threat to the aesthetic purity of Maplewood Gables. Your property has been found in violation under Article 4, Section 2, Subsection C of the Maplewood Gables Covenant, read the letter. All exterior decorations must adhere to the community's design standards. Please remove the item within 5 business days or be subject to a $500 fine. Bob stared at that figure, $500, for a lawn gnome. That sum was more than he spent on his monthly electricity bill. It was enough to cover groceries for him and Martha for a couple of weeks. This was ridiculous. And so, for the first time since moving to Maplewood Gables, Bob felt his irritation simmer. He set the letter down, removed his reading glasses, and took a deep breath. They can't be serious, he muttered. Martha was in the kitchen, tidying up after lunch. She came to join him, drying her hands on a dish towel. When Bob showed her the letter, she burst into a short, disbelieving laugh. Then she saw the red warning slip and realized it wasn't a joke. Article 4, Section 2. Good gracious. A gnome? Martha said, raising her eyebrows. It's not like we've built a giant neon sign in the front yard. Bob shrugged. They want me to remove it or pay up. Martha gave him a sly grin. I guess they don't appreciate a little whimsy. Maybe we could talk to the HOA board? In principle, Bob preferred to follow the rules. But there was something about the tone of the letter, impersonal, cold, and threatening, that riled him. Plus, how exactly did one request approval for something as minor as a foot-tall gnome. He felt singled out. After all, he had seen a couple of pink flamingos in another neighbor's yard. Last Christmas, the Winstons down the street had put up an entire choir of plastic carolers, and no one seemed to mind then. So why was his gnome a problem? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Bob decided he'd respond to the HOA letter with a polite email, requesting a formal explanation. He wasn't going to remove the gnome just yet. If they wanted it gone, they needed to give him a good reason beyond a half-baked reference to subsection C. In Bob's mind, they could talk it out like reasonable adults. Unfortunately, as Bob would soon learn, reason didn't always reign supreme at Maplewood Gables. The new HOA president, Winnie Caraway, had her own interpretation of the community covenant, and she was known for her relentless enforcement tactics. The lawn gnome scandal, as Bob would later call it, was about to become the talk of the neighborhood. Before the week was up, Bob received another letter, this time more urgent and with one short, ominous sentence. Failure to remove the unapproved ornament may result in immediate disciplinary action and additional fines. Bob felt his blood pressure spike as he read those words. So much for peaceful retirement. A few days later, Bob found himself in the Maplewood Gables Community Center, a tidy one-story building with a pastel green exterior and a parking lot that had spaces labeled "Residents Only" in gleaming white letters. There, the HOA board was scheduled to meet on a Thursday afternoon. Seated at the long, forward conference table were 6 people, most with a certain air of self-importance. Winnie Caraway presided over the group with prim posture. She wore a purple blazer and matching lipstick, projecting the image of a person who took her role with gravity. Next to her sat Martin, the HOA secretary, a balding man who seemed constantly on edge, as if bracing for a sudden gust of wind. There was also the treasurer, Eileen, a retired accountant who tapped her pen with impatient precision, and 3 board members who occasionally chimed in. Bob clenched his jaw but tried to maintain civility. The meeting began with a roll call, and then Winnie moved briskly through the agenda. From overhanging tree branches to the color of mailbox posts, nothing was too small to be dissected. Bob waited, swirling the tepid water in a styrofoam cup, for his turn to speak. Finally, Winnie looked up from her notes and addressed him. Mr. Jenkins, you submitted an email requesting clarification on Article 4, Section 2, subsection C. You're here to appeal the notice you received regarding an unapproved lawn ornament. Is that correct? Bob stood, politely clearing his throat. Yes, Ms. Caraway. I'd like to understand why a small lawn gnome is considered a violation. I've seen other ornaments around the neighborhood, flamingos, small statues of rabbits, even holiday decorations. Why am I singled out? A flicker of annoyance crossed Winnie's face. We treat all violations equally, Mr. Jenkins, but sometimes we can't catch everything at once. She consulted a thick binder labeled Community Covenants and flipped through it. Specifically, your gnome is deemed an anthropomorphic figure, which is restricted under the rules. Flamingos are not anthropomorphic. They represent real animals, albeit stylized. The board believes that anthropomorphic figures can degrade the community's aesthetic. Bob blinked in disbelief. So, a statue of a rabbit is acceptable because rabbits are real animals, but a gnome, a fictional representation, crosses the line? He struggled not to roll his eyes. Forgive me, but that's a bit arbitrary. Winnie's posture stiffened. We aren't here to debate personal taste, Mr. Jenkins. The covenant is clear. Your lawn gnome is in violation. Martha, who had accompanied Bob, raised her hand. But pink flamingos aren't exactly local wildlife, either. Couldn't a gnome just be considered a whimsical decoration? It's not obscene or offensive. The treasurer, Eileen, glanced at her watch before weighing in. The rule was put in place last year to limit, shall we say, yard clutter. People were putting up giant toadstools, elf houses, miniature dinosaurs, things that got out of hand. The board decided anthropomorphic figures were the easiest boundary line. I don't love the flamingos either, but they don't breach the same rule. The rigidity of it all made Bob's head spin. It felt more like a courtroom than a community meeting. But he stayed calm and asked, "So, is there a formal process to get a waiver? I'd like to apply for an exception. The gnome is only 12 inches tall and stands in my flower bed. It's hardly an eyesore." Winnie pursed her lips. A formal waiver process does exist, but it's typically reserved for medical or safety exceptions, like wheelchair ramps or specialized handrails. She glanced around at the other board members. A lawn gnome doesn't qualify. Besides, I'm not sure the board would be inclined to grant such an exception. It sets a precedent we can't support. Bob inhaled, frustration building. All right, let's look at the bigger picture. Are we so concerned with uniformity that a small, harmless statue can't be allowed? Is that really building a stronger community, or is it just controlling? A hush fell over the room. One of the board members, a quiet older woman named Rosalie, shifted uncomfortably. Winnie, however, seemed unfazed. She must have encountered challenges like this before. "The rules are in place for a reason, Mr. Jenkins," she said with a steely calm. "Every homeowner here agreed to abide by them upon purchasing their property, including you." Bob felt Martha place a gentle hand on his shoulder. He calmed himself. "So what's next?" he asked. Martin, the secretary, piped up. "According to the notice, you must remove the gnome within 5 business days or face a $500 fine. If you continue to refuse, additional fines can accumulate. We can also impose further restrictions, such as barring you from certain community amenities, and in extreme cases, we can place a lien on your property." A shock wave of anger buzzed through Bob's chest. A lien on his property? Over a small statue? This was madness. He looked around at the board members, many of whom stared at him with impassive faces. Winnie thanked him for coming, then briskly moved on to the next agenda item, a discussion about the acceptable shade of white for exterior shutters. In that moment, Bob realized 2 things. First, the fight for his lawn gnome was going to be tougher than he thought. Second, the HOA wasn't just an annoying group of neighbors with petty preferences. They were a powerful entity within Maplewood Gables, able to impose serious financial and legal consequences. After the meeting, Rosalie, the quiet board member, approached Bob and Martha with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I don't personally mind your gnome. I think it's kind of cute. But Winnie, she's very strict about the covenant. If I could help, I would, but she's got most of the board voting in lockstep." Bob thanked her, feeling both frustrated and oddly touched by her gesture. "Thanks, Rosalie. It's good to know not everyone is so rigid. I appreciate it." As he and Martha headed home, Bob mulled over his options. Give up and remove the gnome? That felt wrong. The principle mattered. But was a $500 fine, possibly more, worth the fight? And what if it escalated beyond that? Despite the tension knotting in his chest, a small seed of stubborn determination took root. The next day, Bob woke up early, poured himself a cup of coffee, and walked out onto his front porch. The small gnome still stood in the flower bed, its fishing pole angled toward the bird bath. Bob sighed. Maybe it wasn't the statue itself that upset him. It was the broader issue of being told what he could or couldn't do on his own property in a way that felt arbitrary and unreasonable. Still, it was time to decide if the stand he was preparing to take was worth the risk. He sipped his coffee, gazing at the pastel houses in the morning light. One thing was certain: Maplewood Gables was a battleground now, and Bob Jenkins wasn't sure he'd come out unscathed. 2 days later, a peculiar spectacle drew attention to Bob's front yard. At precisely 9 a.m., a white sedan with the Maplewood Gables logo on the door parked at the curb. Out stepped a young man in khakis and a polo shirt, an HOA volunteer, apparently. He walked up to Bob's property, clipboard in hand, and started snapping photos of the gnome, the flowers, the walkway, everything. Bob, who had been pruning his rose bushes, straightened up. "Excuse me," he called out. "Can I help you with something?" The volunteer glanced up, looking slightly sheepish. "Just doing a compliance check, sir," he answered, as if that explained everything. Without further comment, he returned to his photography mission, circling around to capture the gnome from various angles. Martha, who had joined Bob outside, commented dryly, "They're taking pictures like it's the crime of the century." Bob set down his pruning shears, face reddening with irritation. "If this doesn't stop soon, they'll have an entire album, Gnome, the offending object." His attempt at humor only partly concealed the frustration in his voice. Word of Bob's predicament had spread through the neighborhood. Some residents shook their heads, quietly sympathizing but unwilling to speak out. Others seemed to relish the drama, gossiping about Bob's rebellious streak. A few, like Rosalie, offered discreet words of support. Still, the threat from the HOA remained real. Another official notice arrived that afternoon, doubling down on the ultimatum: remove the gnome within 48 hours or face immediate fines. That evening, Bob and Martha invited their longtime friends, Don and Patricia, over for dinner. Don, a retired attorney, might have some advice. Over spaghetti and meatballs, Bob explained his predicament in detail. Don listened carefully. When Bob finished, Don leaned back in his chair and sipped his iced tea. "HOAs can be tricky, Bob," he said, choosing his words with care. "The documents you signed when you moved here, did you read them thoroughly?" Bob sighed. "I thought I did, but I must have skimmed over the part about anthropomorphic yard decorations. Who would read that far into the details? I assumed it was standard HOA stuff: keep your lawn trimmed, no cars on blocks in the driveway. This seems like overreach to me." Don nodded. "It may feel overreaching, but legally, if it's in the covenant, they can enforce it. However, HOAs often rely on intimidation. They might not want to go to court over a single lawn gnome. It's bad publicity, and it could be expensive for them." Martha brightened. "So we could fight it?" "Possibly," Don replied. "But you need to consider the emotional and financial costs. If you dig in, they might escalate. It'll certainly sour your relationship with the board and possibly some neighbors. Is that a fight you really want?" Bob glanced at Martha. They'd moved to Maplewood Gables for a tranquil retirement, not for legal battles. Yet the principle of the thing grated at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that capitulating was tantamount to accepting a level of micromanagement he found absurd. After dinner, Bob walked Don and Patricia to the door. Don gave him a sympathetic pat on the back. "You have options: comply, keep fighting on principle, or try to find a compromise. I doubt there's an easy path. But good luck, Bob." That night, unable to sleep, Bob got up and wandered into the living room. From the front window, he could see the faint outline of the gnome by moonlight, standing resolute in the flower bed. Bob let out a low chuckle. "I guess we're in this together," he thought wryly. The next morning, Bob decided to attempt a small compromise. He moved the gnome from the front yard to the back patio. Perhaps that would satisfy the HOA's aesthetic concerns. Out of sight, out of mind, sort of. Later that day, he wrote the HOA an email explaining he had relocated the gnome to a less visible location, hoping this might appease them. Within hours, Martin, the secretary, responded curtly, "We appreciate your attempt to comply, but the covenant applies to any exterior-facing portion of the property. The gnome remains unapproved. Removal is the only option." Bob slammed his fist on the kitchen counter in disbelief. "They won't even meet me halfway. The back patio is practically hidden behind the house," he told Martha. She only shook her head, sharing in his frustration. Early the next day, Bob stepped outside to find a fresh letter taped to his front door. It was an invoice for $500, an official fine for noncompliance. Attached was a note: if the ornament is not fully removed within 24 hours, additional fines may follow. Bob's jaw set in a grim line. He had expected this, but seeing it in black and white was still jarring. $500. He could pay it, but that would just encourage the HOA to keep strong-arming him. Worse, they'd likely fine him again if he still refused to remove the gnome. This was precisely the scenario Don had warned him about. Unable to contain his frustration, Bob tore up the invoice and tossed the pieces in the trash. He knew that wouldn't change anything, but it provided a fleeting sense of satisfaction. He then took a moment to think. Was there a more creative route here? As Bob considered his next move, the roar of a lawn-mower broke the silence. He looked across the street to see his neighbor, Ed, expertly guiding the mower across the yard. Ed gave Bob a quick nod. He'd heard about the trouble with the HOA and had once confided that he, too, chafed under their draconian policies. But unlike Bob, Ed had never challenged them. He'd learned to keep a low profile. Bob was starting to understand why. "Morning, Ed," Bob called half-heartedly. Ed waved back. "Morning, Bob. Tough break about the gnome. Let me know if there's anything I can do." He sounded sincere but resigned, as though he believed no one could truly stand up to the almighty HOA. Bob sighed. Perhaps it was time for something bold, something that would shine a spotlight on how absurd this was. Maybe if he could rally enough neighbors, the HOA board would see reason. He suspected it wouldn't be an easy task. People who lived under strict HOAs often toed the line, fearing retaliation. But if no one stood up, the rules would only get more oppressive. Bob had a suspicion this was about more than just a gnome. It was about who was really in charge in Maplewood Gables. Martha approached him on the porch, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide, Bob, I'm with you. But let's think carefully. We worked hard to retire here. We don't want to spend our golden years at war with the neighborhood." He nodded, pulling her close for a side hug. "I know. I just can't stomach the idea of letting them push us around over something so small. It's the principle." She offered a small, understanding smile. "Then we fight smart." Looking into her eyes, Bob felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't going to back down easily, and if he played his cards right, maybe he could reveal the HOA's inflexible stance for what it was: petty authoritarianism. One thing was certain: he was done bending over backwards for a rule that made no logical sense. The following week, Bob invited several neighbors to his backyard for an impromptu barbecue. He made sure to tell them it was just a casual get-together. Burgers and beer, nothing fancy. But behind the scenes, he had a larger agenda. He wanted to gauge how others felt about the HOA's tactics. To Bob's mild surprise, more than a dozen people showed up. Some he knew well, like Rosalie from the board, who apologized profusely for attending in a personal capacity. Others were folks he only recognized by sight from community potlucks. Several admitted they were curious about the gnome controversy, and wanted to see if Bob really was the neighborhood rebel they'd heard about. As hot dogs sizzled on the grill, conversation started to flow. A retired teacher, Ms. Klein, spoke up. "I have a couple of little wooden fairies in my yard. I always worried they might violate the covenant. So far, nobody's said anything, but maybe it's just a matter of time." Another neighbor, Roger, grumbled over his plastic cup of lemonade. "Last year, they fined me $200 because my recycling bin lid was slightly cracked. Claimed it was unsightly. I ended up paying because I didn't want to rock the boat." Others chimed in with their own stories of petty infractions and perplexing fines. The more Bob heard, the clearer it became. Many people in Maplewood Gables felt ambushed by the HOA's random enforcement, but few had the nerve to push back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the belief that no one else would stand with them. But now they were seeing a potential rallying point in Bob's fight. Rosalie looked around nervously, making sure no one was recording. I'm not proud to admit this, but Winnie has the board under her thumb. She's extremely organized, and she interprets every covenant rule in the strictest possible way. She also has a knack for using procedural loopholes to keep us from overruling her. Sometimes it feels like we're just a rubber stamp. Bob frowned. But isn't there a way to vote her out? Rosalie lowered her voice. Technically yes, but most board members haven't served long. Winnie's been president for 4 years, so she has seniority, plus she's good at politicking with certain cliques. If we had enough homeowners petitioning for a recall, we could trigger a new election. But that would be a big undertaking. A fresh wave of determination washed over Bob. This was bigger than a single gnome. If Winnie and her rigid style were causing this much grief, perhaps it was time for a leadership change. Yet Bob didn't want to come off like a zealot orchestrating a coup. He just wanted common sense to prevail. Still, as the group continued sharing stories, the idea of collective action emerged organically. A few neighbors mentioned how fed up they were, not just with the fines but with the culture of fear. By the end of the barbecue, there was talk of forming a volunteer committee to review the most unreasonable HOA rules. Bob wrote down names and phone numbers on a notepad. They agreed to meet again soon, only this time, it wouldn't be a simple backyard gathering, it would be a strategy session. That night Bob and Martha sat at their kitchen table, scanning the list of neighbors who had expressed interest. It wasn't a huge number, but it was enough to spark hope. We might actually have a chance, Bob said, taking Martha's hand in his. She gave him an encouraging nod. The next day, Bob decided to adopt a two-pronged approach. First, he'd file an official dispute of the fine. Don had given him a template letter, citing ambiguous language in the covenant about community aesthetics. Bob typed it out carefully, including references to how other decorations had been permitted. He requested a formal hearing, which the HOA bylaws stated he was entitled to. He doubted it would do much, but at least it put his challenge in writing. Second, he reached out to local media. A small-town newspaper, the Maplewood Courier, had a Community Spotlight section. Bob emailed the editor a brief summary. Local retiree faces $500 fine over a whimsical lawn gnome. HOA runs amok? He figured it was a long shot, maybe they'd ignore it. But if they picked it up, public pressure could work wonders. A few days later, Bob received a voicemail from the paper's reporter, Dina Phillips. She sounded eager. Mr. Jenkins, I'd love to cover your story. The Courier has heard from other Maplewood Gables residents with similar complaints. Let me know if you're available for an interview. That same afternoon, Bob received another official letter from the HOA, this time threatening an additional $200 fine for failing to remove the gnome by the extended deadline they'd given him. Bob read it twice, feeling anger twist in his gut. But instead of tearing this one up, he tucked it neatly into a folder labeled Evidence. Meanwhile, the grassroots conversations among the neighbors were picking up steam. Rosalie whispered updates when she could, letting Bob know that Winnie was furious about the sudden chatter and was even considering calling a special session to address the unrest. A neighbor named Jill had started an informal petition, canvassing door to door to gather signatures demanding an amendment to the covenant that would allow small, tasteful decorative items, gnomes included. Bob had never seen so much organized activity in Maplewood Gables, which made him both hopeful and anxious. Within a week, Dina from the Maplewood Courier came by to interview Bob. He set the gnome out on a small table in the backyard. He'd moved it indoors temporarily to avoid further fines, but brought it out as a visual aid for the interview. Dina snapped photos, scribbled notes, and asked pointed questions about HOA overreach. She also interviewed Martha, who described the emotional toll the fight had taken. Bob was cautious but honest in his comments, making sure he stayed respectful even while criticizing the board. When the article was published, titled, Retiree Fights Baffling $500 HOA Fine Over Lawn Gnome, It caused a ripple effect in the community. Copies circulated, neighbors whispered, and sympathizers from outside Maplewood Gables commented online in support. Winnie and the board were apparently furious at the negative publicity, but that didn't stop the wave of opinion forming behind Bob. Finally, the HOA board scheduled an emergency hearing to address the matter and hear Bob's formal dispute. It would be held in the community center, open to all residents. The day of the hearing, Bob arrived early, uncertain how it would go. He clutched a folder of documents, sweaty palms betraying the nerves beneath his calm exterior. Martha stood beside him, offering silent support. As the room filled, Bob realized he had more allies than he'd expected. Ed, Ms. Klein, Roger, Jill with her petition signatures, Rosalie. Even Don and Patricia came, ready to show solidarity. Winnie and her usual allies sat at the front, their faces tense. It struck Bob that this wasn't just about a gnome anymore. It was a referendum on the HOA's values. The fate of Bob's fine hung in the balance, yes, but so did the direction of Maplewood Gables itself. He took a deep breath, looking at the sea of concerned faces. This was the moment they'd been building toward. With a flutter of excitement, and no small amount of trepidation, Bob stepped to the podium, prepared to make his case in front of the entire community. One way or another, the battle of the lawn gnome was about to reach its climax.